Okay, hello, World Geography. Prof. Braden Evans checking in for your Week 7 pre-recorded asynchronous lecture. So as we talked about, this week will be an asynchronous pre-recorded lecture focused on human populations and urban ecosystems. I think you'll find it to be in a topic. And, unfortunately, I'm not able to be present in our live class for this week. And so this has, remember, shifted our presentation dates for our infographics. So rather than this week, we're doing it next lecture, which is actually in a couple of weeks, right? Not this week, not next week because it's reading week, but week 8, the week following reading week. Okay? All right, so since this is pre-recorded, I'm going to try to burn through it. I'm going to try to go through a little bit more quickly than usual because really, it's not as engaging to sit back and listen to something that's pre-recorded. So I'll try to keep it short and sweet. Okay, so we'll start off sort of in an urban ecology context. Okay, so it's important to understand urban ecosystems. It's a key to understanding sustainability in the geographic context, right? And so here, when we're talking about ecology, we're talking about interactions between organisms, right? Between living organisms and the non-living parts of the environment as well, right? And when we're talking urban ecology, we're talking about these interactions within the context of cities, urban systems, places where people live, right? Because we shape the landscape so much with our development. Okay, so traditionally, obviously we've studied natural spaces as ecologists, right? That's some of the work that I do. And so, but more recently, we've come to understand that if we want to really understand ecology, we have to integrate the human social element, right? No ecosystem is undisturbed anymore, right? People are influencing ecological systems to varying degrees, but we're always sort of having an impact on that, right? More and more of our population is living in a city environment, and more of the important areas that we consider to be ecologically sensitive are colonized by people. So to understand nature, we got to understand the people around it, and to understand the people and their well-being in our societies, in our cultures, we got to understand how they're interacting with the ecosystem. Okay, so more traditionally, we would build these models that would say, okay, ecology, let's just assume an untouched ecosystem, right? But that's not realistic. That doesn't exist, right? So on the other end of the spectrum, we've got places around the world that are heavily influenced by humans we've totally changed the landscape, right? But the reality for most systems is somewhere in here, right? Along this gradient, along this spectrum, where people are having some impact and some interactions with the natural system surrounding them. Okay, so we know more of the world's population has become urbanized in recent years, right? Most of us live in cities, and if you factor in towns, almost all of us live in cities or towns, right? And so the ecology of our urban environments is more important than ever, right? Now we need to understand how we're getting and using the services provided by our ecosystems, right? How are we making use of the landscape? Okay. All right. So, waste issues, water use issues, resource issues, and then on the sort of ecology side of it, like habitat loss and fragmentation that species that are not humans have to deal with as well, right? We need to consider the plants and animals that we're sharing our space with, right? One thing we've come to understand a lot better in recent years is that our health, physical health and wellness, and our mental health and wellness pretty heavily relies on, the green space that surrounds us more than we like to think. Okay. So we're putting a lot more emphasis on studying that. How is the ecology of urban systems affecting the humans that live within it? Okay. Okay, I could probably skip that one. Ultimately, we're looking at, inputs from ecologists, economists, behavioral and social psychologists, and all different disciplines when we're trying to understand like the human context of ecosystems, right? Human ecosystems. So one of the things from a conservation and sustainability standpoint is that um, a lot of the world's important, rare, and endangered species live in areas that people have chosen to settle. Okay. So, um, I guess, when you think of resources that are important to people, like, water for drinking, but also water for shipping and transportation, right? Those resources are also important for all kinds of other species, right? You think of sea turtles and, dolphins and manatees in, marine ecosystems and ocean ecosystems. They all share the coastal areas that we like to develop for our beaches, right? So we got to understand that a lot of the places in the world that we have developed are sensitive areas with, some rare and sensitive species. Okay, so we need to sort of act accordingly, right? Make sure we understand we're sharing the space. All right, and that's why we're looking at this from such an interdisciplinary standpoint, from the people standpoint and from nature's standpoint as well, right? So I might have mentioned this in week one, but for the first time in history, in 2008, we crossed the threshold where more than half of the human population on Earth, more than 50% of the people, live in urban areas now. Mm. This has been a steady increase since the era of the Industrial Revolution, and it's been driven by two primary factors. Okay, first of all, there are more jobs in cities. Okay, so the expansion of commercial opportunities in urban areas has drawn people in from rural, from the countryside, right? And then we need fewer and fewer people to do agricultural work because we've mechanized our systems. We have tractors now. Instead of using, 5 laborers and an ox to plow a field, now you have one person driving a tractor, right? And so with less of a need for people in agricultural areas and more job opportunities in cities, obviously there's a big draw for people to move into urban centers, right? Okay, so obviously that's really going to affect our cities, right? It puts a lot more pressure on our cities and their resources because we've got more and more people moving into them, right? Due to this whole industrialization process. Okay. Um, all right. Yeah. So up until 200 years ago, there was so few people in cities, right? Everybody lived out in the country where you had some land, right, that you could use to produce food for yourself and your family, right? You needed that space. And obviously, over the last 200 years, we've seen this big shift. So 1800, 3% of people lived in cities. 1900, that number had grown to 14%. 1950, it was 30%, 2000, and then 2008, we crossed the 50% threshold. And this is kind of what our projections now look like as we look ahead to the year 2050, right? So urban populations, you can see they started out down here below 1 billion, right? And they've climbed today. We're somewhere around here, maybe close to 5 billion. And we're going to be up over 6 billion by 2050. And then you look at rural populations. Yeah, there was a population increase, up until about 2000, and then started to kind of level off and drop. So actually our rural populations are, and have not only level off, but are starting to shrink. Okay. Okay. So this is a pretty cool exercise here if we look at this. So this gives us some sense of what's going on with population growth across the world. Okay. So back in 1900, 122 years ago now, these were the world's biggest cities. Okay. London, New York, Paris, Berlin, Chicago, Vienna, Tokyo, St. Petersburg, Manchester, and Philly. So let's see, let's count them up. So let's count European cities. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 European cities in the top 10, right? American cities, 1, 2, 3 American cities and just 1 Asian city. So 1 from Asia, 3 from the States, and 6 from Europe back in 1900, okay? Let's see. I wonder what this chart would look like today. Okay, by 2030, this is a bit of a projection, but it's, you know, it's consistent with where we are today. Look at this. Number 1, Tokyo. Number 2, Delhi. Shanghai, Mumbai, Beijing, Dhaka, Karachi, Cairo, Lagos, and down here, Mexico. This is the only New World city, right? It's the only one on in the Western Hemisphere. Everything else here, just about everything else, is Asian, right? Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and well, let's say the top 7 are Asian, even though some parts of Egypt are considered to be Asia as well, right? Africa and Asia, but you get the picture, right? So there's a big demographic shift in around the world in 100 years' time, where the world's biggest cities went from places in Europe and America to Asia, right? And here's a map of the world at night. This looks at industrialization, right, across the world. So you can see lots of light infrastructure and commercial development in North America, in Europe, and then you can see India really stands out here, in parts of China and Japan, right? But you know, a lot of parts of the world that really don't have that sort of development as well. So a real shift, change in urbanization across the world. Okay, so what about these urban populations? What do they look like, right? So we saw the chart, a couple graphs, a couple slides ago, where we could see that people were moving from the country to the city, right? So now, what do these cities look like? Well, in the less developed world, this means, you know, poorer countries, right? Those cities are growing and expected to grow very, very quickly, right? Because you've got a sharp positive slope here. But then in the more developed cities, so the richer countries like Canada, the US, a lot of Europe, right? The growth is much more subdued, right? It's much flatter curve, okay? So we're getting bigger cities faster in poor countries, and really cities that are staying about the same size in rich countries, okay? And that's important because we need to think about what cities look like in rich countries and poor countries. So if you think of a rich country like America, this image here makes me think of when I used to live in Florida with my family. These big, sprawling suburbs, lots of houses that you know, have very little green space, and you can see from the image between the roads and the driveways and the sidewalks and the houses, there's almost no permeable soil, right? It's all paved over, it's all concrete. So when the rain falls, when water falls, there's not too many places for it to go, all right? But it's very neat, very organized, very structured, right? These places are likely to have electricity, they're likely to have, you know, drinking water, bathrooms, clean sewage, right? Even sometimes we're talking about a pool, usually some air conditioning, right? That's what a growing city in a rich country looks like. One of these big boxes here, big homes inhabited by one single family, right? You know, we're talking about large areas of land accommodating relatively few people. So in the world of ecology, we call that a large ecological footprint, right? The footprint of each person is really big. When you think of the construction materials and energy costs to not only build, but maintain these houses, right? And so we call that urban sprawl. It's where cities are spreading out laterally, growing outward, and eating up some rural land, right? Okay, now this is maybe what urban expansion looks like in a poor country, a country that's less economically developed, right? You get urban migrants, right? People coming in from the countryside, from rural areas, looking for work opportunities. And a lot of times they'll settle in these informal settlements, right, on the edges of cities. Very, very high population density, right? Much less room per person. Here we don't necessarily have sewage infrastructure. You have open air sewers in some cases, not necessarily access to clean drinking water. You can have, dozens of people sharing a bathroom, up to 100 people sharing one bathroom, and issues with contaminated drinking water. And if you look at these physical structures, right, they're at risk of, some extreme weather events, right? So when it comes to climate change, people in poor countries that are moving to cities are at greater risk than many other parts of the world. No electricity, no paved roads, issues with waste disposal, right? And you're living without a contract. You don't have like a lease for your land or a deed for your property, right? And so if at the whims of the municipal government, these settlements can be dispatched, right? People can be displaced. So a lot less security. Okay, so now remember I talked about ecosystems existing on a spectrum, on a gradient. Well, urbanization works this way as well, right? On one extreme, you have a very high ecological footprint. On another extreme, you have a very small, low ecological footprint. And then you have these things in between, right? So this is relatively higher density housing, what you see here, these large apartment buildings, lots of families in living in a relatively smaller area. So you might call it medium density or high density housing when we look at townhouses and apartments. And in this case, you've got, a wealthy country with high standards of living and modern facilities and infrastructure, safe infrastructure, but, a lower footprint because the density is greater, okay? Much less space is being occupied than if you had all these detached houses, right? And it's a type of urbanization that has a smaller impact on biological diversity and the ecosystem that surrounds the human environment, right? We've got less space that needs to be paved over, more permeable land, and more green space, right? When you think of that ecological footprint, think materials and energy used to construct the houses, right? And then the ongoing maintenance and operation of these buildings requires a lot of energy as well, right? And so the health and well-being of people living in these different urban neighborhoods can vary pretty dramatically when you look at what it looks like in a poorer country versus a rich one. Okay, so in the coming decades, obviously, we're going to have some big challenges in the developing world, in more poor countries, what urbanization will look like and how we can manage it in the interest of, public safety and the environment, right? And sustainable aspects. And so when it comes to ecology, urban environments are great testing grounds. What we find is that ecological theory tends to hold, right? Our concepts, our ideas tend to be pretty robust in disturbed environments. So in environments where people play a role, all our concepts about ecology still apply. We're still interacting with our environment in the same way. So that's a plus for urban, ecological study, right? It tells us that, okay, it still makes sense in these disturbed systems. We look at things like the niche of organisms, the competition between different species, right? Predator-prey interactions, food webs. It's kind of interesting because where I'm living here in Scarborough, I've got a little bit of green space behind my house, and there is, a thriving community of organisms. We have coyotes and foxes that compete against each other for some limited resources, right? Like raccoons and skunks and rabbits. And we have, some trees that are competing for soil and sunlight with sometimes invasive species, trees that are coming in from another part of the world. So lots going on in urban ecosystem and a great place to study ecology. That's for sure. And when we talk about health and well-being, you know, we're talking about sanitation and drinking water, but we're also talking about things like, you know, violence, sexual violence, privacy and security, right? And all of those things that affect our mental health as well, right? Um, there's been a lot of research that has supported the idea that having access to nature and open spaces improves people's, you know, mental health condition, right? And typically, when we have urban sprawl, so those rich countries growing, you know, suburban areas outward, you tend to have lower health outcomes for people. People tend to drive a lot more, so they're not walking, so they have, you know, less physical fitness, more risk of traffic and pedestrian fatalities. So there's so much stats to support that, you know, urban sprawl is probably not the best way to go, right? You can't walk to school or shops, you got to drive everywhere, right? And so the ideal situation, your goal, your ultimate goal in an urban living environment is to feel some connection with your community, right? People who have that tend to have much sort of better mental health outcomes. Mm. When on the other end of the spectrum, when you have too much population density and you've got some poverty, you can run into situations where crime rates are higher and people's social condition begins to deteriorate because you're overcrowded and you become sort of afraid of your community. So that's always a possibility as well, right? And so there, you know, the risk of depression is greater when you have these sort of factors that relate to like social disorder, crime and violence and that kind of thing. Okay. So a big area of research